kami ialah merdeka.
Nikmati keseruan masa lalu dengan subscribe channel YouTube Majalah Historia, serta aktifkan notifikasinya. Channel Majalah Historia adalah salah satu produk dari Historia.id, berupa video ilustrasi sejarah berbasis artikel yang pernah tayang di laman Historia.id. Channel ini tidak hanya berisi tema sejarah yang bikin kening berkerut, macam politik dan militer, namun juga tema ringan seperti kuliner, gaya hidup, hingga hiburan. Pantengin masa lalu dengan share, like, komen channel YouTube Majalah Historia.
Untuk mempertajam sebuah pemikiran, meluruskan yang bengkok, menyindir yang jumawa, mempertanyakan sebuah pernyataan, membuka yang tabu, membentuk yang tak terarah, mengangkat yang direndahkan, dan memanusiakan yang ditinggikan. Itu kenapa opini ada.
Awali hari dengan informasi terkini, menjadi sumber referensi dan inspirasi di setiap aktivitas. Melalui news video portal, segala informasi dapat disajikan cepat, akurat, dan lengkap. Dengan kekuatan teknologi digital, Maidcom.id hadir dengan berita pilihan yang dikemas secara menarik. Maidcom.id, digitally inspire people.
Stop sebar berita hoax. Dapatkan kabar terpercaya dan benar melalui e-paper Media Indonesia dengan berlangganan senilai. Unduh aplikasi Media Indonesia di Android, registrasi dan pilih paket berlangganan. Lakukan pembayaran dan nikmati layanan e-paper Anda. Informasi lebih lanjut. Unduh aplikasi Media Indonesia sekarang juga.
Heroes Remaking History. Please notice our guidelines for Jakarta International Literary Festival YouTube channel viewers. Viewers are welcome to subscribe to the Jakarta International Literary Festival YouTube channel to get notifications about the panel discussion schedule. Panel discussions will be held at Zoom meeting and linked live to the Jakarta International Literary Festival YouTube channel. Discussions will be held in English. Indonesian translation will be available on Jakarta International Literary Festival YouTube live screen. Questions and comments can be submitted via the live comment column or live chat on the Jakarta International Literary Festival YouTube channel while the discussion is in progress. Questions will be forwarded to the moderator to be mentioned to the speakers. Discussions will also be translated by a sign language translator. Thank you and enjoy the festival. Selamat datang di Road to Jakarta International Literary Festival 2021 Heroes Remaking History. Berikut adalah panduan untuk mengikuti panel diskusi melalui kanal YouTube Jakarta International Literary Festival. Pemirsa dipersilakan untuk subscribe kanal YouTube Jakarta International Literary Festival untuk mendapatkan pemberitahuan mengenai jadwal panel diskusi. Panel diskusi dilaksanakan di Zoom meeting dan ditautkan live ke kanal YouTube Jakarta International Literary Festival. Panel diskusi akan disajikan dalam bahasa Inggris. Terjemahan bahasa Indonesia tersedia langsung di layar YouTube Jakarta International Literary Festival. Pertanyaan dan komentar dapat Anda sampaikan melalui kolom live comment atau live chat di YouTube Jakarta International Literary Festival saat panel sedang berlangsung. Tim kami akan meneruskan daftar pertanyaan Anda kepada moderator untuk disampaikan kepada pembicara. Penerjemah bahasa isyarat juga akan ditampilkan dalam panel diskusi ini. Terima kasih dan selamat menikmati festival ini.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. My name is Hera Diani. I'm a journalist and the managing editor and co-founder of Magdalene.co, Jakarta-based feminist web magazine. Welcome to Jakarta International Literary Festival. This is the second JILF after last year, and I'm so glad, I'm delighted that despite the pandemic, we still can have JILF this year. Thank you for all the committee of JILF for the hard work that we can enjoy JILF this year, and special shout out to the festival curators, Isyana Atarini and also Roni Agustinus. Don't forget to follow Instagram account of JILF at JILFindo or JILFENDO, and also Twitter account JILFindo. This afternoon, the theme of the panel is Donning the Cap on the Power and Limit of Representation. Thank you again for the committee for picking me up. I'm honored to host this panel because this is something that is close to my heart. It has been the focus of Magdalene, the online magazine that I co-founded. Our vision and goal is exactly that, to provide platform for the voices of women and other minority groups, including sexual minority. In a world where we still experience cultural dominance, representation is seen as a way to bolster diversity of thoughts. But often representation means that there is a burden of presenting an inspiring narrative arc or for a character to be somewhat of a heroic figure instead of showing a character with their full spectrum of humanity. In the world of literature, what does it mean to have meaningful representation? How would or should it look like? So without further ado, to discuss discuss this further, we have three wonderful speakers with us this afternoon. Sorry. The first one is to talk about the issue and maybe finding the answer and solutions to these questions. The first speaker is Bonni Rambatan, is a writer and illustrator, who does philosophy and comics. Hi, Bonni. They also
Hi.
run a business that strives to promote diversity and equality while struggling within the capitalist framework, as hypocritical and futile as this may sound. Interesting. On the off chance that the communist revolution actually takes place, Bonni claims that they will be ready to walk themselves to the guillotine for this scene. I hope this won't happen. Yeah. Please, Bonni, the floor is yours for our first speaker.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Hera, and thank you so much, everyone here, for having me speak. So, I'm a bit of a curious case here because I do things that seem contradictory, and I think they are contradictory, right? Because on the one hand, I write philosophy. I do leftist philosophy, and I do essays critical of capitalism and so on. But on the other hand, I also run a business, which is a comic business, right? So that's kind of like, how do you do that? That's why I kind of felt like, okay, if you do a revolution, come on, count me in. I'll be one of the first people to, walk myself to the guillotine. Oh, yeah, hopefully that might not happen. I don't know. But essentially, what I wanted to do when doing the business was that I wanted to bring together a lot of artists and a lot of writers to be able to, bring forth a diversity of voices. By this, I mean that, we want to create stories that matter, that, representation is really big things. It's a really major thing to us in our mission. So in the face of this pandemic that we have this year, first of all, when I started the business, it had pretty good traction, right? Because people were expecting a diversity of voices. People are expecting more and more representation and so on. But the more that the more that I do this, that I do this business, and the more that we are entering this crisis within 2020, within the pandemic, it became more and more obvious that those stories that are diverse, at least the ones in my case, right? I'm not speaking like in a very broad and general sense, but the ones in my case, those are one of the first to be slashed, right? Because those are like, okay, you know what? We like representation. I think we believe in what you do. This is a good thing, but this doesn't really sell. We prefer if you'd make something more. Can you do something like a fantasy romance thing? Maybe a high school girl suddenly wakes up in a different dimension where she is a princess, and she is suddenly forced to marry this rich billionaire and so on. That's what people want, right? Because that's what we keep hearing. It's not just from one platform, from multiple platforms. That's what we keep hearing. So essentially, the message that we got was that representation is good as long as it can bring money in the pockets of those that are already in power, right? And that's where the problem lies, right? So I'm sure a lot of people have better luck, but it's almost as if marginalized voices, they're worth it to bring to the front as long as there is a large enough market to hear their voices, right? And that's where I'm starting to question this idea of representation and all these things, right? Because it's not just about the surface. It's not just about it's not about representation of people inside the stories themselves, but it's also about what goes on behind the screens, who writes those stories. But it's even beyond that. It's also who are the people making these decisions, who are the people distributing these kinds of narratives and how they are distributed, right? I'm gonna go that was my personal case, right? So I'm gonna go on a bit of a tangent here, and some of you might have watched, was it The Social Dilemma, the documentary on Netflix, right? And one of the most favorite, one of my most favorite quotes there was by Jaron Lanier, the theorist, like the father of virtual reality. There, he says that, imagine Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia is great. Wikipedia is, you can access this wealth of knowledge for free, right? Everyone can do. Everyone can access. Everyone can even edit that if they feel that they have better information. So that's great. But imagine now if Wikipedia gives you information based on who you are, based on where you are in the world, based on what things you like to consume, based on the color of your skin, based on your gender identity and sexual orientation. And imagine if if you look for certain information, the articles on Wikipedia get tailored and modified, maybe just slightly, in order to make it fit more with your worldview, right? So imagine if that is the case. That sounds pretty ridiculous, right? I mean, right now we can laugh about that, but the fact of the matter is that that is already how we consume information each and every day. Like, for example, on Google, your search results, they are tailored to who you are, right? And if you, on social media, the things that you see, the advertisements that you see, you're talking about buying shoes with a friend, and suddenly all the ads pop up there, right? And okay, maybe that can be annoying, but it goes far deeper than that. So have you ever had this experience where, especially if you're located, for example, in Indonesia, because that's like my own experience, right? Have you ever had this experience where you suddenly get locked out of your account, for example, on YouTube, right? You get locked out of your account, and then you browse YouTube, and what do you see, right? All these things, what are these videos? What are these clickbaits? What are these pranks bordering on sexual harassments? What are these things that are obviously hoaxes and just put there to generate your attention, right? So when we look at that, it's very easy for us to actually say that, oh yeah, it's like that because it's what the Indonesian market wants, right? Because that's what it's about. You go onto YouTube, and because the people want that, so they serve that, they deliver that. But there's this inherent violence in there, isn't it? In which case, but by which I mean that you are already like these the space of the media landscape that we have today is already prejudiced against who we are or what it assumes it knows about us. And then we are served by these information. Why do I say violence? But because people have these certain slurs that they call, that they like to throw at people who are marginalized, people who are poor, people who do not have the same material condition and the same access to information that let's say people like the more privileged people do, right? And what happens is that we use those slurs in order to demonize those people, as if those quote unquote terrible tastes are the fault of those people, right? Oh, YouTube, does this, it's because it's the fault of the people. But isn't it kind of like the other way around? I mean, if you have, this leads back to representation itself. So, for example, let's say if you manage to even publish a lot of these narratives, right? A lot of these diverse voices, they're all great, they're all excellent, it's there, and let's say that a lot of platforms actually love it, and business conditions are better, and so on, and we have wealth of new voices in the market. Who gets to see them, though? Right? That's the question. Who gets to see these narratives? If the algorithms by which we consume information is still working against people who are marginalized, who are underprivileged. So that creates just, a bigger gap of awareness of these issues of representation. It can be the case that a lot of people are just very open. All of a sudden, privileged people are suddenly very open to the diversity of gender and sexual identities and so on, while the majority of the people are really, really closed off and think that's like the ultimate sin. You're causing all these natural disasters and earthquakes and so on because look at all these, look at all these sinful people telling all these stories, right? So that's basically what we have right now. So what I'm saying is that there are these issues beyond representation. And if you look at representation only in the sense of, the wealth of information available in the market without observing how the market itself is already skewed, then I think that's going to be a pretty, I think that's going to be very little of the problem solved there, right? Because there's a lot of things, there's a lot of homework to be done here, right? So I'm gonna end on a slightly more theoretical note here that you may or may not be familiar, but I'll try not to get too theoretical. But there's the concept of hegemony by Antonio Gramsci, right? Hegemony is essentially when you have power, and that power is dominant, and it's very hard to question that power. On the other end of hegemony, there are people who are called the subaltern. The subaltern are people outside of those structures of power. So in this case, we can see that people who don't have access to this market, this wealth of diverse voices and narratives, people who we are supposed to maybe speak for, but might not want us to speak for them, but then they don't know how to speak. Those are the subaltern, right? And post-colonial theorist Gayatri Spivak then followed up this notion in her essay called "Can the Subaltern Speak?", which is really fascinating in its interrogative form. It is formed as a question because it's a question that we until today cannot answer. Can the subaltern speak means that can people who are outside these realms of information and power structures, can they actually develop their own narratives? But if they can develop their own narratives, who's going to hear them and who's going to distribute those narratives? And if they're already integrated into narratives, does that not create more exclusion to those who are not yet privileged enough if we are still talking about the same structure, right? So what I'm trying to, obviously I'm not giving any kinds of solutions or whatsoever here, but I think what I want to present right now is this question that representation itself is not enough. There's a lot of homework. There's a lot of structural issues that we need to tackle. That as long as we have an economic structure who will always look at the bottom line, then it means that representation will always serve the purpose of profit. And I'm not sure that's what we want. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonni. It's very interesting. If I may sum up from your explanation, it's how representation is still in the surface level, right? It's still in the case that it has to be, how do I say, palatable to the public, and how it's still head to head with capitalism. There's issue with economic structure and power. So if I may quote your own essay, representation is great, but focusing on surface level, representation alone can derail us from more substantial epistemological struggles. Okay, thank you, Bonni.
Thank you.
It's interesting. We may have more questions to you later. We will go on next to our second speaker. Norman Erikson Pasaribu. Erikson Pasaribu based their poetry on dreams. They worship cheese donuts. Ooh, nice. Their newest book is a collection of short stories, cerita-cerita bahagia, hampir seluruhnya, published by Gramedia Pustaka Utama in this year, in 2020. Tiffany Sau's translation to their poetry book, Sergius Mencari Bakus, was published by Tilted Axis Press and Giramondo in 2019. Norman will not read or explain something, but instead we will have a question and answer session. So Norman,
but can I open with something first?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello everyone. So I just published a book of short stories this year, and it's titled in English "Happy Stories Mostly" or "At Most" or "Almost," and it's a collection of short stories about queer Batak lives mostly in Bekasi. And earlier this year, I had a discussion about, not earlier this year, like maybe last month, I had a discussion about the book with my publisher, and then one of the editors asked, what's the challenge for queer writers in Indonesia to showcase their work and like show themselves to the public, and I answered the readers. Because I think we need to talk about a reading of literary work with hetero gaze in the Indonesian context. And for example, earlier this year, last month, sorry, there is a publisher in Indonesia that made a literary festival last month, and then they invite some writers that write about with like LGBTQ characters, and then it made kind of like a little Twitter riot last month because of their Twitter caption. Like in Indonesian, apa siasat mereka agar tulisan mereka tetap bisa bernilai sastra, bukan sekedar propaganda politik identitas belaka. I feel I kind of laugh when I read the tweets because it's kind of like show, even before you write as a queer, you already face a prejudice against your own work. Like you need to like prove and explain to the readers that it's not a merely identity politics propaganda, but it's like have literary value, whatever that means. And then I feel like it stems from, how to say, like maybe uh, years of like hetero gaze reading, where hetero critics reading writings by like mostly hetero men reading writing by women, by queer writers, and then or by other marginalized people. And mostly of these critics probably have like middle class background, so it's another kind of like another gaze, like privileged gaze against the poor and the working class. So it's when we talk about representation, we should also talk about the gaze that look at the representation. So and I have to like there are so many things that we can get from what Bonni said earlier, but it's important to like when we talk about representation, we talk about like multiple levels, like representation as like the characters in the book, and representation as like the writers that wrote the book, and then representation as like people behind the scene, like the editors who like make decision maker, like who will get to publish and who won. So it's important to like asking whose imaginations at work when we look at a literary work, like whose imagination is that, what kind of gaze that the writer, like the editor, like the publisher, like the readers use when we look at a book. So that's basically like a start. You can ask me more questions.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, how is it your experience with the issue of representation in the publishing world in Indonesia?
Um, I think
Was it difficult?
I think it's tricky because like many people today kind of like obsessed with like representation as a form of justice, even though like representation is not like a hint of justice. And then kind of like it's usual, oh, I'm not, for example, I'm not homophobic, I have 3 gay friends or something. I'm not homophobic because I like Frank Ocean or like something like that. It's often happen, and then kind of like it happened all over in the publishing world. So kind of like we are not like, for example, we are a progressive publishing. We publish 2 gay writers, for example, but it's not like, it doesn't mean that there are safe space, for example, for queer writers. It's not like when we get into the publishing world, we won't have like prejudice or like, how to say, stigmatized, or like our work is not like downgraded. I mean, I grew up with heterosexual love stories, and then even the queer stories that queer love stories that I read when I was younger are written by hetero people. For example, Mbak D, who wrote Supernova, and then it has a gay couple characters. And then, for example, she also wrote a short story Lara Lana, and then those words are those are like literary work about queer people written by hetero people. So it is like there is like the best selling work in Indonesia. While, for example, if a queer writer kind of like, from my own experience, like when I won an award, I got attacked. So it's kind of like when hetero people write about queer people, they are praised, while when queer people write about themselves, it is attacked. So I think it's also about what kind of quote unquote representation that is like palatable, like easy to digest, like fine, like for hetero people. So if it's like, how to say, kind of like challenging for them, or like not friendly for them, they are kind of like being more, lebih mudah marah seperti itu, menurutku, in my opinion. So it's when we say about what happened, how to say, um like what happened to me in regarding of representation is tricky, because like I feel like I gain many readers here, but then some of my readers, of course, have a hetero, kind of like hetero gaze when read my work. So even though they like it, they have some, for example, they think so. I feel like we need to note that when a queer person write about characters, I feel like it's written for queer people. So if hetero readers read it, they can like it or they don't like it. But I think it's a bit they need to hold themselves back when they like make a comment, or like as a critic they make like jump into that area, because like they need to remember about their own bias. But it's like in Indonesian context, it seldom happen. People just kind of like throw everything they think about, because like the dominance, like they have the power to shape the narrative. So yeah, they did it. So yeah, that's it.
Do you mean that it's still a novelty for readers to read queer works for queer people, or is it almost like a fetish to them?
Kinda, and then I think it's also toxic to have that kind of fetish, because kind of like it's kind of like making you expect someone to write in certain kind of way. For example, um even, I don't know, it's really hard to talk about representation in Indonesia, like because queerness is not in a vacuum, like it's like connected with many other kind of things that make a person, like its economic condition, like its geographical location. And then when kind of like when it's like, for example, in my work, it's like queer, and then it's Batak, and it's like Christian background, kind of like many people just talk like to me like, oh, I'm confused. So it's kind of like very too complicated for them because I think we are in Indonesian context in the public media, we are so dibiasakan to like just see Japanese and Muslim lives. So and probably like hyper middle class, where like people live in a really rich place, um, and then like even poor people kind of like just a necessary. It's the usual what we see in the media. So when people talk about like queer representation, they just want it to be like a vacuum. They don't want it to like be more layered, even though like queer people, okay, if I don't write it like as a whole, I don't write about what I want to write. So it's kind of like there is a really big gap between queer creative writing and then queer reading. So I mean, sorry, hetero reading.
Okay. Earlier this year, a couple of months ago, there's a controversy regarding the literature awards from the Ministry of Education and Cultures. How the nominees are all male authors, and just show how it's still the literature is still dominated by masculinity, very Jakarta centrist, and all that. What do you think about it in terms of you as a queer writer?
I think, for example, we need to remind ourselves first that representation is kind of like an out like a few that based on output. It's like output based thinking, but it, like justice is always inherent. So when we talk about like justice, we need to like think more about what's behind the scene, what's hidden under the cover, rather than like on like what's appear on the outside. So I think like just let's just how to say, just like common sense. I mean, we have so many great women writers, like it's no question. So like to come up with like a 5 categories with like all men in all categories, it's obvious that it's like it has bias against women. And I feel like we need to talk also about how many, for example, non-Japanese people like on the list, or like is there any queer person on the list? So it's a bit like it's a mess. So but how to say, so if we want to like liberate all of these kind of like people that are like being marginalized by the system, I think we need to like bongkar semua, like just tear down the system, like change the people who make decision. So but then how to say, it's a bit hard to do that, because even the younger people, some of them want to protect the status quo because like they are benefited, some of the young people are benefited from the status quo, so it's hard. And then I feel like I need to say that queer people, we don't have to change the world. We are not saviors of, for example, we are not like, we don't have to save anyone. We just need to like save ourselves. We just need to take care of ourselves, because it's already hard. So when we talk about how to say,
Sorry, you're frozen. Okay. Maybe we can talk later with Norman. There's a technical issue. Oh, okay.
Sorry. Okay.
He's back. Okay, go on. Go ahead.
Terakhir sampai mana?
Queer people don't have to change. We don't have to be a savior.
Oh, sorry. I mean, we don't have to like be inspiring for like, oh my God, he inspires change. Like she inspires change. They inspires change. It's like we don't have to do that. But then we are often like situated in those kind of discussion gitu. So
Yeah.
for example, when my book is published last year by Tilted Access and Juramundo, some people kind of like contacted me and that kind of like asking if I can help them to get published, even though like I don't have the decision power to like make anyone being published. And I feel funny. Do people this, for example, to Eka, to Mas Eka, who is like more well known, but then maybe kind of like because I'm kind of like reachable, so they contacted me. So it's kind of like it's a very weird situation as a queer person, like people kind of like asking you to be like the wind of change, even though like, oh, I'm just like, I want to sit here and eat, something like that.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll have questions later, maybe. If I may sum up from your answers, that it's interesting what you say about how representation comes in many layers, not just characters, but also writers, publishers, and all. And we need to change, like tear down the whole system, the whole ecosystem, because there are so many gaps in it. And how queer people, you feel that queer people have so many expectations on them, while queer people are here to just tell their stories and to present their narration. Okay, thank you so much. We're going to go next to our third speaker, Eunice Andrada. Welcome, Eunice. Eunice Andrada is a Filipina poet, educator, and organizer. Her debut poetry collection, Flood Damages, published by Giramondo Publishing in 2018, won the Anne Elder Award and was a finalist for the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Poetry and the Dame Mary Gilmore Award. Her previous works have been awarded the John Marsden and Hachette Australia Prize in 2014 and shortlisted for the Fair Australia Prize in 2018 also. Through her work in eco-poetics, she was awarded the Australian Poetry and NAHR Eco Poetry Fellowships in Northern Italy. Of Ilonggo heritage, she was born in the Philippines and raised moving between Iloilo and Manila. She currently lives and writes on unceded Gadigal land. Please, Eunice, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. I'm Eunice Andrada. As was mentioned, I am speaking currently from unceded Gadigal land. So I would like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land, who are the Wangal people of the Eora Nation. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I am so thrilled to be part of this discussion, especially after getting to listen to such rich and interesting ideas from both Norman as well as Bonni, and I really can't wait for our discussion later. For my own presentation, through the lens of my poetry and my arts practice, I want to talk about the responsibilities and the limitations that I feel in offering genuine representation, as well as what genuine representation even means, but how that can help combat the damaging notions about the communities that I belong to. So I want to dig into some details about who I am and the context in which I write, because those are entirely relevant to what I want to focus on. Although I sometimes write in Tagalog and Hiligaynon, I mostly write my poems in English, which comes with its own baggage and its own responsibilities. So I'm a Filipina poet and educator who was born and raised in the Philippines. And then I migrated to Australia in 2012. And I've been living here for more than 8 years. And many kinds of tensions have arisen from this migration. For example, I used to blend in without the burden of being racialized as a woman of color. And now I live somewhere where that label is inescapable. I also belong to Generation Z. So I grew up with the weird and wonderful internet. And what was striking to me, even from a young age back then, is the way that the language of the internet has captured what society thinks of my communities. For example, through the internet came reminders that Filipino women were not viewed as equals. For example, not too long ago in the early 2000s, if you Googled the word Filipina, you would be bombarded with sites for mail order brides. These would be pages and pages and pages of results from Google. And even venerable sources like the Oxford English Dictionary and the Modern Greek Dictionary once only defined Filipina as a domestic worker and a nanny. And today, if you type in the word Filipina in Google search engine, you would be given links on how to date a Filipina or news reports of Filipino women murdered. So it is through language that I learned that Filipino women like me could be dehumanized to the point that we could only be perceived as one of two things, either objects to be desired or objects to be destroyed. And no matter which end of the spectrum we fall, there is violence. For Filipino women, negative representations in literature and in broader media have deadly consequences. These negative representations of Filipino women as unintelligent, submissive, and sexually promiscuous have a direct correlation to violence against Filipino women. Through these kinds of representations, we are seen as not wholly human and therefore suitable targets of violence. And amidst these representations that portray us merely as bodies in service, how can we then be seen as humans whose bodies are deserving of care and respect? Here in Australia, where I live, Filipino women are almost 6 times more likely to be victims of homicide more than any other Australian women. This is evident amidst numerous disappearances as well as killings of Filipino women across the continent. The violence against Filipino women is so ingrained into our culture, both in the Philippines and overseas. And the negative, dehumanizing representations of Filipino women, representations that are often not even authored by Filipino women, it's authored by mostly white men. These kinds of representations are what fuel this violence. So that is the context, and those are the layers of damage that I write against. So when I first began writing and performing in Australia, I was one of 4 Filipino writers who were active in the performance and the festival circuit. I could literally count how many of there we were. Now that this number has soared, I have so much hope because Filipino women are finally having the access and the platform to rewrite the narratives that have been imposed upon us. Through our writing and through our performing, we're now able to declare that we are alive and we are capable of representing ourselves so that others can no longer get away with speaking over us. For example, going back to what I mentioned earlier about the Google results for the word Filipina, that was in the early 2000s. And around that time, in response to that phenomenon on the internet, Filipina writers and activists came together to launch an online campaign to Google bomb the search results for the word Filipina. And as part of that Google bombing, each Filipina writer or artist with an online presence was encouraged to include their ethnicity in their online biographies. And that was so we could push out all the derogatory websites out of immediate view, so that when a young Filipina girl, for example, wants to Google the word Filipina, instead of being met with these dehumanizing websites, they would instead find reflections of themselves. And that, I think, is a truly beautiful thing. And that campaign was a huge success for a while, until those kinds of websites and content resurfaced, like the kinds of content that I mentioned earlier. But following this tradition started by other Filipino women, Every biography that I've written includes my ethnicity before my occupation as a poet and an educator. Despite this, I think it is a heavy burden to be expected to represent a community. By no means do I feel like I am a representative of Filipino women through my writing, or that my writing can encompass the experience of all Filipino women. And I don't want it to be misunderstood as such. I believe my privilege disqualifies me from speaking for other people. For example, I'm an Ilonggo woman who does not live in Iloilo currently, so I can't speak for Filipino women from across the archipelago and overseas. And my poetry and my perspectives can't be taken as a stand-in for the actual lived experience of millions of Filipino women. For me, when I write, I don't feel the burden of representing my community, because all I'm doing is representing my own experiences and my own worldview through my writing. I resonate so much with what Norman was saying earlier about, this burden of responsibility. Like, I just also want to write and eat and sleep on the couch. But I think at the root of it, I think it's the work of white supremacy to force us to separate the individual from the community. It is the work of white supremacy to force us to look to one person and one voice to speak for an entire community. Norman also mentioned the hetero gaze or the heteronormative gaze earlier, which I think is a great observation. But I think in addition to that, I think the colonial gaze is at work when it comes to reading the work of marginalized writers. It's the colonial gaze that separates my voice from the voices of the communities that I belong to. Instead of my voice being taken as one of the representative voices, I want my writing to be seen as something that is inextricable from the voices of other people in my community. But that again comes against the tensions of white supremacy, because white supremacy dictates that only one voice must be essentialized as the speaker for all marginalized voices. And while this might seem to be like positive representation, because you have one person or a few people representing certain perspectives or certain cultural standpoints, what it actually is the removal of other people's agency to speak for themselves. And that too is a form of violence against marginalized communities. Like Bonni has eloquently mentioned, the struggle of representation is not the only problem. It is only a symptom of a disease that goes further down, and that disease is white supremacy. And so the fight for representation must be in conjunction with broader social movements to abolish white supremacy. Without the recognition that the struggles of representation, race, class, and gender are interconnected, we are merely trying to solve the symptoms of disease instead of destroying the toxic and unrelenting structure through which it thrives. For me, it is of no use to have non-dehumanizing representations of Filipino women if our body count continues to soar. And I think also that at the heart of this struggle for representation is a struggle for access. I think we wouldn't have the need to have this conversation, three panelists, we wouldn't have this need to have this conversation about the burden of offering representation if our voices weren't essentialized as the only voices out there talking about the experiences of people like us. But the way it stands now, for me, because there are still so few Filipino women writing and performing in Australia, my perspective and the perspective of a few other Filipino women are assumed to be these totalizing views that every other Filipino woman must have. And the representations that we offer are seen to be the only valid representations out there, when that's not the case, because there are so many other stories and perspectives that are undiscovered. But what we need to do is to break down the elitist barriers that stop people from having their art and their perspectives recognized. For me, meaningful representation means not only having one or a few voices speak for everyone. Meaningful representation means being able to break down those barriers and being able to elevate every voice, making sure that they have the access and the opportunity to share their perspectives, whether that's through their art or by other means, if that's how they want to be heard. And for me, instead of speaking for a community, I want to create art that is an offering to my communities. My poems that speak about my own histories and experiences, those are the kinds of genuine representations that I can offer. That is the genuine representation that I have agency over because it is my own. At the moment, my conscious objective when I write is to inject tenderness into my poems, to disrupt the violent as well as dehumanizing narratives that are perpetuated by non-Filipino voices. I also want to write poems that honor the working women in my family as more than utilities for export and more than bodies to be desired or destroyed. So through my writing, as well as through hopefully other Filipino women's writing, as we're growing all together, we are slowly disrupting this master narrative, as well as reclaiming our bodies, our lives, our histories from the colonial gaze. And I hope my poems can be offerings. And I know that my poems won't ever tell the full story. And they don't aspire to tell the full story too either. I hope my poems instead exist as bridges to other Filipino women's voices and their own stories. I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Eunice. It was really beautiful and wonderful. And I think what you just said resonates a lot with the situation of Indonesian women. How you said that media representation portray us merely as bodies in service. How the most important thing is our physical attributes instead of humans whose bodies are deserving of care and respect. And you also mentioned how femicides are still rampant. It also happens in Indonesia. You said that it is critical to give voices and platform for women to claim the narrative instead of being under the fetishizing gaze of a cis white male, the colonial gaze, and its master narrative. The fight for representation must be in conjunction with broader social movement, you said, to abolish white supremacy. It is also been voiced by Bonni and Norman earlier. And how meaningful representation does that mean that only one or two voices come up, but also providing wider access so that more voices can be heard. Thank you so much, Eunice. We are now entering the Q&A session. Is there any question from the audience?
Can I just speak? Can we talk amongst ourselves? Okay.
Sure.
No,
Yes.
I wanted to follow up on that. I think it's very it's very fascinating that you said, the point you mentioned, Eunice, about that we can't really pretend to tell whole stories. We can't pretend to entire stories. We can't even pretend to be able to represent who we are in the face of this, in the face of the diversity that the wealth, the multiplicity, the multitude that we are. Right. I think that's the key to this issue, isn't it? Because I think most of the time people write pretending that they could tell the whole story. Right. I think what should be asserted is that no matter how much diversity that we point to, there will always be excesses, right? There will always be a wealth of voices that are not represented. So I think the fight is a continuous fight. It's not something that we can pretend to, okay, just put a few more boxes and we're set, right? I think there will always be people with, you know, that don't fit into those boxes. Even people who pretend to fit into those boxes in essence do not, right? And I think you mentioned Eunice, both Eunice and Norman also mentioned about colonialism, which was something that I didn't. Eunice mentioned more of that, and Norman mentioned about the heteronormative gaze. I think what's violent about that is that we tend to see certain kinds of people as the default, right? Mm-hmm. So I think even people who mean well to bring more representation still tend to see that representation is just these, you know, cute little ornaments that we have. Oh, people with more colored skin, people with diverse gender identity, but the universal basis, the universal default is still a white cis heterosexual male, right? I think I completely agree with you, Eunice, that that's what we need to destroy, and with Norman too, that we need to dismantle a lot of these things. Yeah, I'm not gonna talk too much. There's a lot more questions.
Let's get off this Zoom. Let's get off this Zoom right now. Let's just get to destroying things.
Yeah.
Smashing. Yeah. We have a question here from the audience for Bonni and Norman. What is meaningful representation to you? Is there such a thing? Maybe Eunice can also jump in. Please, maybe Bonni first. What is meaningful representation to you?
Okay, so I'm gonna get a bit controversial here, maybe. There's this thing. Okay, first of all, I think meaningful representation is, if you get down to this is a representation of a particular identity. You know, as long as you're you know, as long as you are respectful of that identity and so on. Yeah, I think that's going to be, you know, respectable and meaningful, but it's not going to be totalizing. It's never going to be enough. But on the other hand, I also believe, and this is my position that I think might be controversial. I also believe in the notion of universality. That I think there's a wonderful quote from Salman Rushdie. I think Zizek mentioned this. I'm not sure where Salman Rushdie actually originally quoted, but he was asked, like, you know, what do you think is the best Indian literature? What's your favorite Indian literature? Who's your favorite Indian author? And Salman Rushdie said Jane Austen, right? Because Pride and Prejudice is something that, you know, it has white characters, but it has really universal struggles of these people, right? So what I'm saying is that sometimes we can find representation in characters that are not of our own kind, and maybe that does come from a place of privilege. But again, I think even if I see someone like me out there, right, I think there's always something else that's not represented. And on the other hand, if I see someone that is not like me, I can still feel like that parts of me are represented. So I think it is a tricky question. I think here that we should move beyond identity politics here. It's not just because, you know, we need fully to have similar signifiers, but I think we can find universality of struggles, and this is how we can win against white supremacy. I'm not sure if you guys agree. I'm not sure if I want to hear from Eunice and Norman as well after this. But I think this is where I think the Black Lives Matter movement is also beautiful in that regards, because I think in the universality of struggles of Black people, we can also find, you know, a similar kind of oppression at work here, even though not exactly, but there's a universality of experiences and of oppression. And I think that's where meaningful, quote unquote, meaningful representation comes in for me.
Can I answer?
Yeah, sure. Yes, I would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I think when we talk about meaningful representation, there are more questions. I mean, let's ask ourselves, who has the power to make meaning? That's the
Yeah.
first question. I mean, like I said in my little talks just before, um, what does it mean to like write and then being read by like a heteronormative gaze? Do you make a good and meaningful representation when you are like being read by, like, for example, a homophobic white supremacist? It's kind of um
True.
like we also need to remind people that when queer people write about themselves, like I really love what Eunice said about offering. I think it's similar. I write about my queer life, so another queer person may connect to it. So but I need hetero people to buy my books.
Yeah.
So like, please buy my books so like I can keep creating queer stories for queer people. Thank you. And then but it's like it's really true what Eunice said, because we feel like the meaningful quote unquote representation, it can be meaningful only if it like sampai dalam bahasa Indonesia, sampai like if it like reach the destination very well, and then it needs so many kind of like bridges, like. And then and when we talk about meaningful representation, we also need to remind ourselves, do you write to represent? I don't.
Mm.
And then
True.
it's like a year ago I was on a panel that, like, I was on a panel about taboo, and then I was asked, do you write to make taboo? I didn't, I just write. So it's kind of like there is this always question, like never ending questions about, do you write like as a identity politics, blah blah blah, do you write to like make representation, do you want to show, like, educate the heteros? I don't want to educate heteros, you can be dumb and I don't care. Like, I mean, like can we just kind of like, all I want to do is kind of like step out of like heteronormativity for a while, like just like leave me alone, like something like that. So it's kind of like, even when you write, you want to like, how to say, unlearn the world. You want to like forget for even for a moment, like the expectation that comes when you are you. So that's like when we talk about meaningful representation, it's a very for me it's a very complicated uh, questions, because like, for example, I myself believe that queerness is like a very important part of me, but then there are also more things like that. Like, for example, my parents' Christianity, it really affect how I see the world, or like their economy status, it really affect how I see the world, or like the way that I grew up in Bekasi. Of course, it's gonna be different with a person who grew up in Jakarta, for example, and then I'm a Bataknese person, and then of course it's gonna be different from like a Japanese person. So it's kind of like it has so many things that complicate the layers of like representation. So it's hard to answer that. So if I and and it's also important what Bonni said, because like I remember, oh my god, I forgot the names. Who wrote Citizen, Eunice?
Oh, Claudia Rankine.
Yeah, Claudia, like that's my favorite book. So Claudia said that it's funny for her that most people who came to her and then like, oh, your book, it means so much to me, I see myself in it, is Asian women.
Hmm.
So it's really
Surprising.
interesting that how a book about how to say, like, a black people being killed by the police is actually touching Asian women in
Yeah.
America. So it's kind of like when we say meaningful representation, we need to ask about meaningful readers.
Mm. Yeah. There's
Thank you.
Fascinating.
so
Yeah.
many. Yeah. Thank you
Agree.
for that, Norman. There's
Yeah.
so many levels to this. I just want to just share
Yeah.
an anecdote. This is not
Yes,
so much
please.
my answer, but an anecdote I got a few years ago from an old white man in response to my book. He was like, "Your experience as, because in my in my, if you don't already know about my poetry in flood damages, I write about my sexuality. I write about, domestic violence that my family went through, immigration struggles and the violence of the state. And then I got this message on Facebook from an old white man writer. It was a friendly message, but he said, I really resonated with the experiences that you mentioned in your book. I feel like I am so at peace. I could die at this moment. He literally said that last part. And I think it's so surprising, going back to what you said, Bonni, about this universality. You're so, it's interesting where we can find representation. But I also, totally vibe as well with what Norman was saying. At the same time, my poetry exists as an offering to my communities. It's not out there to educate, or its function isn't to educate other people. But I can't remember, for the life of me, I can't remember who mentioned this. It's something that I sort of hold close to my heart as I write. As a marginalized person, it's like, as a writer, you know who your audience is. Everyone else is just listening in. So I feel like, though other people from outside our cultural experiences can find representation in our work, looks like they're just listening in as well.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think it's quite unfair to expect people for example, queer people or other marginalized people to educate others, right? Because we just wanna lay back and just eat potato chips on our couch or whatever, right?
And I think that also applies to, sorry to cut in, and I think that also applies to like all kind of writings, films, books. I mean, when your mission is to educate, or you have like the mission, it lacks genuinity. It feels less genuine. Well, the important thing I think is to tell the story, right? I don't think I agree. Yeah.
Like to be there.
Right. And this is a question from YouTube. Hello, I have a question for Norman. As mentioned earlier, heterosexual writer who wrote about the LGBT story was more welcome than the LGBT writers themselves, even though we know it is very important that the LGBT writer convey their own authentic views. How do we make those hetero writers as an ally to remove hetero gaze, as well as helping in voicing the LGBT community experiences? Thank you.
No, I don't. I don't make them alive. I think they need to like show and prove themselves to me and other queer persons that they are alive. I think that should how allyship works. It's not like I try to like gain sympathy from like hetero writers. I think they should prove themselves that they are different from the larger homophobic Indonesian heteros, because like I feel like I think that's equality. That's justice when you don't have to gain sympathy to live. That's basic. So sorry, I don't like make themselves my ally. I think also ally comes naturally. Like with many people, I don't even try to make them an ally, and then they just are. So I think it's more important for me to like, and for example, to like just how to say, try to cope with lives and find way to navigate my life to 2021, and try my best to like not getting COVID because it's expensive to get treated, I think.
Right. I feel you. Yeah. I think what the hetero writers should do, just pass on the mic, right?
Yeah, pass on the mic.
Yeah.
I don't.
With all of your with all the money that you get by writing our stories, try to make like queer emergency fund so you can help working class queer. You know?
Yeah, there are a lot of yeah, no, there are a lot of material conditions behind that. But also I don't quite agree with gatekeeping, the notion of gatekeeping. I think there are a few layers to this. For example, I think if hetero writers want to create queer characters, and I've been creating queer characters ever since I was still socialized and still living as a heterosexual male. I don't know what I am right now, if you can categorize that. But on the other hand, I think in and of itself, the act is not an act of allyship. It doesn't, just like having Black friends doesn't automatically make you not racist, right? So writing queer characters does not automatically make you an ally, but it depends on the kinds of what you write and how you write it, whether you're respectful enough to write it. Because I think gatekeeping these situations might lead to more problems. For example, I was working with writers who are white and male, and several white writers who wanted to write about the indigenous people of some indigenous tribes of Indonesia, right? So you run into that problem, whether is that a right thing to do? Like how are you approaching it? Do you have authentic voices coming in to justify these kinds of narratives? So we are very careful about that. But on the other hand, we had quite an internal discussion among my company back at the time, whether it should be allowed or it should not be allowed, right? And we never really came to a strong conclusion, because I would argue that I think it's okay if people on a privileged position wants to write characters that are not privileged. I think it's okay. First of all, I think it should be acknowledged that it will never be an objective, totalizing representation of the characters. But on the other hand, I don't quite agree with gatekeeping, that we should never allow people with certain signifiers to write about people with other kinds of signifiers. I mean, that's my position anyway.
Right. Eunice, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, it's, even if you write, I think what becomes difficult is when stories are written. If I, for example, were in a more privileged position than the person I'm writing about, and I'm writing a story from their perspective, that's when I think it becomes a little messy, and the question of ethics and responsibility kicks in. But for the most part, I also agree with what you were saying about like the extent of gatekeeping. I think a diversity of perspectives is a good thing to have, but at the same time, like responsibility needs to be present at all times, and just this awareness of power and privilege that underlies how we tell stories and how we share them is important.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. It's interesting that you mentioned earlier, Norman. I'm not homophobic, but if it's if it's followed by but, usually it's not a good thing, right?
Also, it's kind of like the usual. I have two gay friends, or like my aunt is lesbian, so and then very homophobic comment.
Yeah.
It's the same. Like I have two Black friends.
Yeah.
The same energy.
Or like I also have a mother, so I understand women. It's really common in Indonesia. Oh no.
Yeah. Oh, I hate that when people say I have a sister. I can't. I have a sister. I can't be a misogynist. Or
right.
Yeah, exactly. So I can't like I have a wife. That must mean I can't be a misogynist. Like no.
Right. Next question from Franciscus. What is the most significant movement that you did to represent your identity other than writing, and how the society responds to it? Maybe Eunice first?
Sure. I think when you mention that, what is the most significant movement that I do to represent my identity aside from the writing, I think Like the sheer fact of the physicality of my body is does the work of representation. The sheer fact of my body being in a space where it's not or hasn't been historically accepted is really important to how I represent myself. Something that I'm thinking of right now, for example, was this experience of being with other poets who are also from countries that bear the brunt of climate change. Poets from the Marshall Islands, Guam, Samoa, and the Philippines. Being together with them in very white spaces at the United Nations climate talks, and the sheer fact of being there and performing and speaking, not just writing, but speaking and being there with the physicality and power of our presence and our bodies, I think that in itself does a lot of the work of, representation. I think it's not just representation, it's asserting that you have a right to be somewhere.
Bonni, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, whether we like it or not, our physical presence is always a thing that's just, the materiality of our presence is always going to be something that's political in nature, right? The spaces that we inhabit and the way we look, me looking like this, right? Represent who I feel that I am, right? But again, I think this question also comes with the assumption that when we write to represent, which I think has been talked about, has been quite negated in a way in our earlier discussion that like Norman has said. So well, I'm one of those people who is a firm believer that I can never, my true self can never be fully represented in any way, or anyone's self can never be fully represented with, no matter how many kinds of signifiers you throw, there's always a kind of access that eludes that thing. So what I'm also trying to do is that I'm trying to negate some stereotypes, some kind of the things that people expect me to do or to present in a certain way. I try to negate that. So that's part of the things I do in terms of representation, I guess. But then again, it's a complicated topic. It's not just writing. It's not just about presenting. It's not even just about asserting certain signifiers, but also negating certain signifiers.
Norman?
I don't think I represent my identity. I think I don't know. I think it's very simple gitu. I live in a world where people like me and I like often to be told like kill yourself by the people, and then I stay alive. I think in terms of like I think it's already cool to stay alive. And then with my work and with my time that I spend with my work, like my editorial work, I'm one of the advisor of Asian Americans for that workshop, for example. And then I did a lot of, in the past, editorial work for Asymptote, the translation magazine. I feel like I tend to be I have to say doing other things that I feel confident I can do, like for example editing, for example like helping like Indonesian writers to for example like to be translated. I feel like but I don't think I do that to represent my identity. I feel like I do that because I like it, and then I think I rarely see myself like in my head, oh, I'm the gay person. I rarely do that. So it's like most of the time I don't even look at my identity card. So but like I try to do things with my life. Sorry, absurd answer.
No.
No, it's a great answer.
Yeah.
I mean,
I like that.
Yeah, for me, like I'm not hyper conscious of my identity every time, but it's just it's something that consciousness is something that reverberates and like comes back to me through how people like respond to me or my body in a certain space. So like going back to what Bonnie was saying as well about negating certain signifiers that have been imposed upon you. Sometimes I'm guilty of, okay, so you think Asian women or Filipino women are docile? Let me be extra difficult. Let me be just
Yeah.
completely loud.
I think there's this great statement on Twitter that's been circulating for a few years, which is like, God, give me the confidence of a mediocre cishet white man.
Right,
Yeah,
right,
I think that's
exactly, right?
That's just the best. That's just the best way that we can assert our identity, is just to have the confidence of a cishet mediocre white man.
I remember one thing. So my Vietnamese friend, a poet, Nhat Twin, once said like in a panel, she never realized he is a Vietnamese until she went abroad. Until she saw white people on the street. Oh, I'm Vietnamese. So it's kind of like I think it's like it's kind of similar with what Eunice said. Well,
about being hyper conscious. Anyway, but Avianti Arman has a question. She said, "Can we say that the subaltern today is the ones outside the internet realm? Inevitably, the internet dictates how we see the world today. So the issue of representation has actually entered the media layer, not just who has the right or can do the representation. What do you think?"
Yes, absolutely. I'm assuming that's a question for me, because I was mentioning about the subaltern, but feel free to add to me. Absolutely. I think the subaltern today is definitely the ones that are outside of the internet realm, or otherwise, underprivileged. They can't do anything about the internet realm. So yeah, I think representation has entered this certain layer where it's not really about things that are we talked about this throughout this. There's so many multiple layers, but also there's an additional layer of algorithms, and who gets to design the algorithms. Even if you're selling physical books, there are Goodreads reviews or Amazon reviews that are how to make it visible, how to market it out there, and stuff like that. So it gets really complicated, because it's the interplay with all these codes that we don't see even is just creating more and more of this gap of representation. Yeah, I don't want to get too theoretical and take too long a time, so I guess we can just maybe connect it to other discussions.
Yeah, Eunice or Norman, maybe you want to add something?
Yeah, I agree with Bonni, but like for example, this idea is, I think it's not new about like the internet realm, because like in the past we also have like university, like people outside university, like they cannot access like kind of like the articulateness, like being available via education, for example. And for example, like the basic, like the idea of travel, like being traveled, like I first went abroad like maybe 3 years ago, and after that I feel like I see the world very much differently. And I think in terms of like kind of like privilege or like access, it's important to talk about it also. So it's more like, yes, to internet realm, but it has been a really old kind of like problem.
I think that the new part is that there's so many things that are invisible that we don't see. I mean, even right now on Zoom and on YouTube, there are codes behind the screens that are influencing us much more than the older institutions, I feel, and it's all serving the purpose of profit generation for a handful, few people out there. So, and I think this can relate, if I can relate it to other topics now. I mean, even things, debates on Twitter, for example, Twitter rage threads. Of course, it's easy to get caught up in so much rage on Twitter and just exhaust ourselves there. But there's a lot of moralism and self-righteousness that comes with on every side of the spectrum, that comes with online debates like that. But what people don't see is that no matter how much you you're going to rage on Twitter until you're foaming at the mouth. I think the engagement is still beneficial. The data is still being mined by those who own the platforms, who can then advertise certain things to you, right? I think it's quite, people just, well, okay, let them rage, let these marginalized people get angry with each other, but those at the top are just sitting comfortably, earning their company valuations.
Right. Eunice, do you want to add something?
No, I think both Bonni and Norman summed that up quite eloquently.
Okay. Thank you. This is a writer, Febi Indirani said, she said, thank you so much for great presentations from all three authors, Bonni, Norman, and Eunice, Andrada, and wonderful moderation from Hera. Oh, thank you. She has a question to all of you, including the moderator. Oh, this is relating to the confidence of white male you talked earlier, Bonni. Febi said that John Banfield, winner of the 2005 Booker Prize, has suggested that he could not win the prize now because he is a straight white male. Do you have any comment on the statement?
I'm not quite sure how Booker Prize works, so I don't think I'm qualified to do that. I think it can go either way. But I don't think I have enough information of how the Booker Prize or other awards work like that.
I think I want to welcome John Banfield to the club of like millions Indonesians who cannot win the Booker Prize because we don't write in English.
Oh, yeah.
And then I was like, it's kind of funny how like the most privileged often feel like they are like actually marginalized by the situation, even though like it's kind of sucks.
Yeah, how those most privileged feel like they are now being replaced. Oh no, it's not that you're being replaced, it's just your mediocrity is finally being revealed. Because so many
and I feel like when one is like so accustomed to the privilege, even equality feels like marginalization, feels like oppression.
Yeah,
so it's funny.
Definitely.
Right.
Well, I can't speak of John Banfield because I haven't read any of his works. It might be, he might actually be good. I have no idea. But I do, yeah, I do agree that like Gamergate, for example, like the most obvious go-to example for this, right? Just because there are more female voices in video games, suddenly a lot of people are protesting that we are being replaced by these these women who are trying to destroy the video game industry and so on. It's a classic thing.
Yeah, this is why in the past year I've been on white man diet, so I don't read any white man books in the past year and try to immerse myself more on the books from women of color mostly. This is why. But sometimes going back to what universality that Bonni said, that sometimes when I like a book or a writing by white people, it's sometimes I question myself, is it okay for me to like it? Is it like, am I being unfair to people of color? You have like that kind of, you're trying to unlearn or relearn what your bias, but you're just becoming hyper conscious about things like that.
I don't exactly have that, but also on the other hand, I kind of like, I feel like I'm just gonna get canceled anytime. So there are two sides of that. So like I still there's a lot of, I mean, if it's on the level of the author is problematic and stuff like that, then I'm trying, I can't really read J.K. Rowling anymore, for example.
Right. Same,
but if it's just people, this person has certain signifiers, they're a white male. But if the work is good and I feel that I can connect to the work, then I'm completely fine with that. That's probably where I draw my line, although it's a very blurred line.
Yeah, I agree. Like for example, even though I really hunger for a period drama featuring women of color, queer women of color, at the moment I have to settle for things like Call Me by Your Name, which I really like. Oh, I see your wrinkled nose, Norman.
Because I wrote a poem about it.
Really?
Oh, wow.
Okay, I need to read it. But sometimes problematic things can be your guilty pleasure, even
Right,
if
right.
they're written by white authors.
Yeah.
I'll read that poem, Norman.
Like,
Well,
But I do I
go
do
ahead.
think it raises an interesting question. I mean, you can write about that poem, so that means that, you know, even if it might be problematic authors, or even authors that are not problematic but are, you know, on a privileged position, we can always take what they bring to the table and just reappropriate it ourselves, right? Or what do you guys think about that?
I read a lot of white male poets actually, because like they are the most book available cheaply.
True.
For example, in the market. I mean, for example, Claudia Rankine, it's really hard to get her books here. And for example, you cannot order books if you don't have like credit card. Like, you know, there are barriers of access to get those books. And I feel like I always feel like about my resources. Like I want to use my money. I want to put my money on people, for example, people of color or queer people of color. But so I usually kind of like, because I'm an accountant, so I kind of like make a portion. Oh, so this money can go to problematic online book buyings, and this money cannot go to it. It's too good because I know how to say, because it's really hard to get books in Indonesia, for example.
It's expensive.
It's expensive, and then we get poorer and poorer every single year. It sucks. So yeah, that's my life trick. Life hacks.
We don't have any questions. So if you like to, I mean, ask one another, or I have a question actually for Norman. I mean, what about, I mean, sometimes like the queer women have like the least privilege then also have more stigma than queer men. I mean, because of the patriarchy. So, what about queer women writers? Do you see that issues, like they have more?
Of course, and it's even more complicated. But in Indonesia, you know, it's kind of hard to, for example, praise a queer writer online, because then it's kind of like an outing in a way.
Right.
So it's really hard. So if like I can only for example praise someone that is already out, and then even being out in Indonesia, it comes with a lot of, how to say, it comes with a lot of baggage. So you cannot just say like, oh, okay guys, I'm coming out, and then people, oh, we love you, we're gonna give you candies. No, it's kind of like the Jumanji starts, something like that. So it's a bit tricky when we talk about so that's why I feel like many of my queer friendships with it comes mostly on like WhatsApp or like emails, because like it's a bit hard when we talk about it in social media. And then even though, for example, if I recommended this writer because I know she's queer but she's not out, so I'm just like, yeah, I recommend because it's good, something like that. And then because it's already good, but then you cannot kind of like frame it in another like more specific way, because kind of like it's outing for her or like for them. So it's a bit tricky. So and then when we talk about literature in translation, there's even more like, I also want to support queer translators. So if I, for example, oh yeah, I'm gonna like help this queer translator, and then I cannot mention it. So it's just, yeah, So it's for example, for some people it might seem like, oh, this is like Norman helping hetero writer being translated by hetero translator, but it's not. It's often it's not the case. But then, well, you learn to, for example, navigate your life within the social structures that you are in. So I tend to don't care of what people think of me now, because like, even though I don't know, like, I don't want to be sane, but I don't want to be like worried that I am a sinner. Like at the same time, like I just don't give a fuck these days.
And I think this really relates to what you were saying earlier, Norman, that we don't want to have the baggage to educate people or even to represent ourselves fully, because we just we just by existing, that's already a resistance for a lot of the marginalized communities. Because what people don't realize is that it's not just a fashion choice. It's not just something that you do because of a trend. It's not that. But people often hearing people think that you're just doing this to for selfish reasons, just thinking that you are crossing the morality and comfort zone of the masses for all these, or for all your quote unquote weirdness, so that must means you're just a very selfish person. I mean, being told that, living in a country where you're constantly having that kind of prejudice pushed against you, that's it's tough. It's difficult. It gets to the point of, it affects you when you're creating. It affects you when you're communicating, when you're trying to praise, trying to support others. Even things like, even the concept of time, that I would say, people don't really think about this, but people who have dysphoria can't see time in a similar way, because sometimes when an event starts at 1, you need to get dressed up at 10, because you need 3 hours just in case you have dysphoria or a breakdown in the middle. So you skip your entire lunch times because you want to, you have to put on and remove makeup and dress or various things, or maybe stuff like that. Those things that people don't really see. There are all these challenges that people think we're just being, oh yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm just moving towards all these kinds of territories which isn't exactly representation, but these things are super difficult to navigate, even when you're not trying to consciously represent anything, or even when you're dealing with issues of people outside of your own community trying to represent who you are, but they don't get these kinds of subtleties. They don't get the minor points that cause you to break down. That's just all these things. But on the other hand, sorry, I'm kind of going. Just cut me off if I take too long. But on the other hand, I also see internal squabbles within the queer community itself, because it's not really, and even other marginalized folks. But I'm most familiar with like the issues of trans medicalism. So, for example, there are a lot of trans people who are against non-binary people, just because I think there are a lot of narratives where, oh, if you don't want to fully transition, then you're not, you're just a trender, you're just a trans trender, right? If you don't have gender dysphoria, then you're just a trans trender. If you're afraid of medically transitioning, you're, all these things that are internal squabbles within the queer communities itself is also very real. So yeah, it's a it's a whole can of worms. And even we have figures like Milo Yiannopoulos, right, who's alt-right, and he is
gay.
openly gay, but then he hates himself because of that, stuff like that.
Okay, there's a question from Alien, susah namanya, Alien Desha Pawilia. Oh, glad Eunice brought up Call Me By Your Name. I feel like the general public is up to explore the big names in the marginalized community, but then they stop there. Any idea or suggestions on how to invite people to explore other names who are not that well known? Eunice?
I think it also goes back, not just at the readership level, but at the production level. There needs to be a lot more, we can't just drum up hype about one or two people. We need to actively invest in nurturing new talent from marginalized communities. So there are new writers to look up to. So it's not just, this, we're not just celebrating the same names all the time. It needs to go back to the production level. And I think readers also need to demand that. You know, as readers, we need to be like actively saying, we want more of this type of thing. And, I think it goes also to like voting with your dollar. Like, you need to be putting in these material investments into the kinds of voices that you want to see. So if you want to see more of, like Norman's and Bonnie's and my work, buy your books, and that'll send messages rippling throughout the publishing industry that our work is worthy of being read and being celebrated.
Yeah.
So more writers from our kinds of backgrounds and beyond need to have that space too.
Right.
Yeah.
Norman, do you want to answer?
Can I answer?
Yes.
I remember earlier this year about the book American Dust that got like $1 million for the deal, and there's this one writer who said like if you like split $1 million to 100 people of color writing a book, you get 100 books that's like authentic about their experiences. So I think what Eunice say is very right. Put your dollar on us, something like that. But then, how to say? We also how to say, like when we talk about inviting people to other names who are not that well known, we need to be more aware what books, for example, that we tweeted, that we post on our Instagram. I think I told this before in a panel in the past. Like I feel curious about people who kind of like tweeted all the time that we need books by women, more books by women, but then always posted books by men on their Instagram. So I feel like we need to talk about those tendencies. I feel like, I also have great cover, you can also post my book, and Eunice has a great cover. That's the thing, because like I feel like in this era, when we talk about a successful media output, we talk more about the machines that guaranteed success. The more the machines, the more it will be successful. So if for example, if I publish a book and then 5 people talk about it, it will, well, maybe only 10 people buy the book. But then the more people talk about my book, the more my book reach more people. So it's kind of like if you want to help the writers that you love, just talking about it on social media, it will help a lot. And try to like be more kind of like suspicious of what is best selling. No, you don't have to hate them, but then you kind of like, oh, maybe I can put my energy, my time, my money to other people who haven't been get that much of support, something like that. And then I also, as a queer person who get published in other countries, sometimes people call me privileged, and kind of like, in what way? Because like I know it's a privilege to be published in the UK, for example, but it doesn't make me kind of like financially stable. So we kind of like need more reasonable way in reading, in seeing other people's life, because it's really funny when kind of like I was told by hetero people that I am now in power. It's really funny. In what way? Can I, for example, just buy tickets randomly and go to Sydney, for example, or can I get money and buy a new car? I can't. I struggle every day with my family's condition. So it's kind of like there is this, for example, kind of like a successful face for a writer, and then all of the maze behind the cover. So I think like when we talk about successful literature for marginalized community, please try not to see, for example, the idea of being published in the UK as kind of like absolute privilege. Try to see, because when we try to see people like us, kind of like we are moving, we have different privileges when we move in certain rooms. So, for example, when we talk about literature, for example, have a privilege to talk about it more articulate. But then when we talk about, for example, in a public sphere, for example, I may be restrained to talk more about my experiences as a queer person. So it's kind of like not how to say. It's really tricky to, for example, just call someone marginalized. Oh, she's okay now, or he's okay now. It's hard thing to, yeah.
Because you're read by white people, Norman. That's why you're called privileged.
Oh,
right? I mean, there's
no.
that kind of there's that kind of.
Okay, I want to thank
prejudice
Stan
a lot of the
Janet.
time.
I want to thank Stan Janet to read my work.
Okay, Bonni, do you want to add some?
Oh no. That was just a comment. I think a lot of people still have to believe that. I mean, yeah, it feels privileged if you have a wide audience for some reason, right? So even if you're published in Indonesia, you have a lot more readers, but then you get your book translated like in English, and even if the readership is small, it's just sometimes people think that's still a privilege. Yeah.
Can I call it heterojealousy?
Uber.
I love that term.
Okay, thank you so much. I think our time is up. Thank you so much for the discussion. It's very insightful. I love I have a lot of things to learn today. I don't know how to sum up. We have a lot of important points to sum up. So maybe just I want to just say that from all three of you, that representation must go beyond the surface level. So we need to tear down the system, the power structure, the economic structure, because that's been holding the representation of women and also queer people or other marginalized people. And maybe we should give more access to readers and writers. Maybe we should, as readers, we can start by supporting women and queer and other marginalized people. Check your own bookshelf, whether it's dominated by white men or male, heterosexual male. So read more books from women, queer, and other marginalized people. And don't forget that some of the panelist books can be purchased in JILF official bookstore partner, Transit Bookstore. And they can also consult which books are available through Transit's social media on Instagram or Twitter. Their handle is Transit Santa. Okay, thank you so much. So buy Norman, Eunice, and also Bonnie's books.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us in the panel.
Thank you.
It's been great.
Thank you.
So
Thanks
thank
for
you,
moderating.
Jill, for having me also. And next we have another panel at 4 o'clock, so don't miss it. Okay, I think, yeah, thank you.